Welcome to the Pacifica Graduate Institute course on Contemporary Analytical Psychology and Neo-Jungian Studies. I'm George Hogenson, and this first lecture has to do with some fundamental issues in the two systems of analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, going back to the original work of Jung and Freud. Now, for a long time, Jung was characterized, at least in the popular literature and amongst psychoanalysts, as a derivative of Freud's system. Even some Jungians took it for granted that Jung was basically elaborating and expanding the Freudian system into new areas such as the collective unconscious. What I want to do in this lecture is go back to some of those fundamentals and show you how it is that Jung was actually in an entirely different tradition, going back from Freud, and that the two systems were radically distinct from one another in their foundational principles. This is one of the ironies of the relationship between Jung and Freud. They were deeply attached to one another for a period of time, as most people know, but unwittingly, in some degree, did not realize that the foundations of their thinking deviated in very, very fundamental ways, which made it ultimately almost impossible for them to reconcile their positions. There are ways in which they argued with one another and eventually fell out with one another that have, to some extent, characteristics that only can be understood if you understand the underlying issues in terms of the basic theories that they were working from. So that's what I really want to focus on today. There are a couple of other things that derive from that. I have argued in the work that I've done over the years quite regularly that the system of Sigmund Freud, and I want to be very clear, Sigmund Freud, not necessarily subsequent developments in psychoanalysis, but Freud's system was very, very tightly constrained. And the way that I've phrased this sometimes to people is that if you step outside that very tight frame that Freud provided for his understanding of psychoanalysis, you're going to run into the work of Jung, whether you know it or not. And a lot of psychoanalysts don't seem to realize entirely that some of the theory that's developed subsequent to Freud's leaving the scene in 1939 actually sounds surprisingly Jungian. I'll be trying to talk a little bit about some of that towards the conclusion of this presentation. So what are we really talking about today? The issues that I want to focus on begin with the nature of the unconscious. Then I'll try to show you how that relates to repression and projection, the temporal orientation of the psyche, the distinction between symbol and sign, and also word and image, and touch briefly, if possible, on psychosis and libido, and take a look at the origins of the Red Book. But the primary subject that I want to focus on today is going to be the nature of the unconscious. Now, a couple of things here. For one, we're dealing with depth psychology. That's the overarching designation of the kind of work that gets done in analytical psychology and psychoanalysis. The term depth psychology itself was coined by Eugen Bleuler, who was Jung's chief at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich. And Bleuler viewed depth psychology as simply those systems of psychology that take the unconscious or some concept of the unconscious as the primary object of investigation. So we're investigating the unconscious in depth psychological systems, regardless of whether it's analytical psychology or psychoanalysis. Now, of course, as Jung would remark sometimes in interviews, what is the unconscious? Well, it's unconscious, which puts it in a rather peculiar category. We're talking about studying something which is a conscious undertaking, that is not itself conscious and available to consciousness. And that means that the ways in which the unconscious gets studied, described, theorized about, and so on, always has to have some dimension in which it is, the examination is of derivative phenomena that aren't themselves unconscious. I'll try to show you how some of that works in both of these systems. Now, that leads us into things such as repression and projection. Those have a lot to do with the temporal orientation of the psyche, sign, symbol, and so on and so forth. So these other issues here derive from our understanding of the unconscious. So let's take a look at where we start with this. And I'm going to start by turning to a comment that the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze made in his lectures on Leibniz. Some of you may be familiar with Deleuze by way of his book, his late study, Anti-Oedipus, which is a critical investigation of psychoanalysis. But early in Deleuze's career, he was very heavily influenced by Jung. Now, eventually, his interest in Jung diminished as he moved into other areas, but the influence of Jung nevertheless remained. And in the lectures in Leibniz in the 1980s, he makes the following comment. There is a psychology associated with Leibniz. It was one of the first theories of the unconscious. It is a conception of the unconscious which has absolutely nothing to do with that of Freud. Jung reintroduced the Leibnizian differential unconscious to Freud's great anger. And it is through this that Freud considers that Jung absolutely betrays psychoanalysis. So Deleuze is setting up a distinction here that Jung brings into the psychoanalytic discourse and into his discussions with Freud a interpretation of the unconscious that significantly predates anything that Freud did. Leibniz is roughly around 1650 to 1750, and so around 1700 is when his work is going on, and that's 300 years before Freud introduced his model of the unconscious. So let's take a look. Leibniz, of course, is beloved by high school and college students throughout the world for creating the calculus, along with Sir Isaac Newton. But that's not the only thing that he was involved with. And in his metaphysics and his thinking about the nature of mind, he gives us a model of mind and of the unconscious that Deleuze identifies as the precursor to Jung's ideas about the unconscious. And indeed, Jung frequently referred to Leibniz as his most important predecessor in the history of philosophy. So let's take a look. Let me see if I can illustrate to you what Leibniz's ideas about the unconscious would have looked like. Now, this is my attempt to sort of sketch what we're talking about here. And we have this large oval that reaches out to undetermined dimensions. I've drawn it with a very light line for precisely that reason. There's no boundary out here that is the outer limit of this entire psychic system, psychological system. You can go out to the universe. There is an element within this larger field, referred to here, the terms that Leibniz will use for his apperceptions and desires. This is, in fact, the domain of ego consciousness. And apperceptions are those perceptions of some portion of this entire possible world of experience that are available to consciousness. Now, I'm using Leibniz's terminology here, not least because Jung will use the term apperception from time to time. And it's important to understand that apperceptions are those elements of the world or of the total possible space of experience that are available to ego consciousness. Outside of what's available to ego consciousness, you have a domain, and this is elaborating a little bit on the original notion, a domain of what Leibniz refers to as petite perceptions and appetitions, as opposed to apperceptions and desires. These are perceptions that are very, very diminished. They are not typically available to ego consciousness. But it is, and then that sort of ranges out to, again, an indeterminate range, but we might conceivably call this area within this inner area the unconscious insofar as it relates to ego consciousness. And then there's even a wider possible range out here that becomes, in Leibniz's philosophical work, only available to the perceptions of God. Now, just as a footnote here before we go further, when you get to the very conclusion of Jung's system, and I'll go back to this when we've moved along a little bit, when you get to the very final forms of Jung's work on the unus mundus and the fully developed notion of the psychoid unconscious, you are in effect extending beyond even this range here and into this essentially infinite space. We'll try to touch on that again. But appetitions in the unconscious area, desires and consciousness. Let's see a little bit about how these petite perceptions, appetitions, and ego consciousness operate in Leibniz's system. So the petite perceptions, you can have some elements out here that Leibniz sees as potentially from time to time or very lightly being able to interact with ego consciousness, become aware of them to varying degrees, sometimes very slight, sometimes more directly, that ego consciousness can pick up on the petite perceptions and understand their presence in some sense. The other thing about desires and appetitions is that this doesn't have anything particularly to do with desire, say sexual desire, it has to do with the desire of consciousness to enlarge its domain, to extend itself into this area and incorporate more and more of the total possible range of consciousness. And this process, which Leibniz refers to as the development of the soul, he also refers to as individuation. These ideas, the development of soul and individuation, begin with this model of the unconscious coming out of Leibniz. So we have several elements here that we will want to keep in mind as we move along that derive from Leibniz's system of the unconscious that, as Deleuze says, Jung brings back into the discussion of the unconscious, much to the dismay of Freud. So let's move on here. Another mid-20th century French philosopher will give us some hints about where we're going when we move from this Leibnizian model of the unconscious to Freud's model of the unconscious, and we begin to see what the distinctions are. Paul Ricoeur, very important student of psychoanalysis from a philosophical standpoint. I strongly recommend, if you're at all interested in philosophical issues in either analytical psychology or in psychoanalysis, that you read his book, Freud and Philosophy. It is a masterpiece. It's a very detailed and critical examination of Freud's theories from a phenomenological standpoint, and it is well worth reading. So in Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur makes this distinction. He says the movement of thought in the paper on the unconscious. Uh, Freud wrote several papers after the break with Freud that are called the papers on metapsychology, papers on metapsychology, where he is trying to explain the particular underlying uh, principles of elements of his theory. And he has one of them on the unconscious, which is really after the break, his attempt to define his understanding of the unconscious, in particular as a way of distinguishing it from Jung's work. So the movement of thought in the paper on the unconscious leads from a descriptive concept where the term unconscious is an adjective to a systematic concept where it becomes substantive. The loss of its descriptive meaning is indicated by the abbreviation UBW, unbewusst, which we translate as UCS, unconscious. To arrive at the topographic point of view is to move from the adjectival unconscious to the substantive unconscious, from the quality of being unconscious to the unconscious as a system. So you see, if we were to go back to the Leibnizian model, this is unconscious because it is outside the range of conscious representation. But that makes it essentially an adjectival unconscious. It is unconscious, as Jung says, because it's unconscious. It's outside the range of consciousness. So we're now going to take a look, we're now going to move to Freud's system. Now, Freud really has several parts to building up the theory of the unconscious, or the model of the unconscious as he has it. I'm not going to try and go over all of the details of that, but there is one way of looking at it that's quite important, which is to go back to what is referred to in some of the literature as Freud's myth of the creation of conscious and unconscious. It is, for all intents and purposes, a creation myth. The way this works, and I'll try to be fairly brief about this, is that picking up on his reading of Charles Darwin, Freud posits that in some primordial point in time there existed the so-called primal horde, a community of proto-humans where a patriarchal dominant male has break. So, in order to understand how this shift from the adjectival to the substantive takes place, we have to go back to what I've referred to as Freud's myth of the creation of the unconscious, of conscious and unconscious. The way this works is Freud, on reading Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, posits that there existed in some primordial point in time what is referred to as the primal horde. This was a community of proto-humans who are ruled over by a tyrannical father figure who has control of access to all of the females. The young males within that group desire access to the females, so eventually they band together and kill the father. This creates a psychological crisis in what has up to that point been an undifferentiated primordial mind, for lack of a better way of putting it. They experience anxiety, they experience guilt around the killing of the father. The father gets turned into a totem figure, and there is a split that occurs in this primordial mind. It divides into two systems, the system conscious and the system unconscious, under the pressures of anxiety caused by this primal killing. This is why in my book on Jung and Freud, I've referred to Freud's system resting fundamentally on a theory of killing the father. The entire system rests on that Oedipal moment, not simply psychological phenomena that happen subsequent to that point. So now that we have the system split into two parts, there are also characteristics that accompany those two elements. And what we have then is in the system conscious, it can engage in repression of unacceptable thoughts that may come into the conscious system. But very importantly, for understanding the way that Freud's overall system works, is that when this primordial split between conscious and unconscious takes place, the unconscious carries with it what Freud refers to as a primal repression. Now, later in the development of psychoanalysis, especially after Freud's death, there are ways in which the idea of primal repression gets relocated into the developmental, the ontogenetic developmental psyche rather than the primordial psyche. But for Freud, we're sticking with Freud right at the moment, primal repression goes all the way back to that primordial killing of the father in the primal horde. And it gets transmitted down through the millennia to the contemporary world by way of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which of course is Lamarckian evolution. And there were problems that arose within psychoanalysis because of Freud's refusal to give up his Lamarckian understanding of the development of the psyche over historical time. The importance of primal repression is that it acts as an attractive force on analogous phenomena that arise in the system conscious. So if the system conscious begins down this Oedipal route of intending to supplant the father, kill the father, possess the mother, for example, the repression will take place within the system conscious, repression proper, but it will also be an attractive force from the system unconscious, pulling on those repressions. So we get a sort of dual movement here between the repression proper from the conscious system and primal repression from the unconscious system, pulling the energy from that impulse into the system unconscious, but leaving behind, now in an obscure way, the ideational moment that accompanied that desire. The energy then, of course, discharges itself in some form that appears as symptomatology one way or another, as it tries to emerge from the system unconscious. Now, I'm not going to try and incorporate into here all of the rest of the apparatus that Freud puts in the system unconscious, particularly in his earlier system, before he moves to the more structural system of superego, ego, and id. There's a great deal more. Most of you would be at least, I'm sure, to some degree familiar with such ideas as the censorship and other aspects of Freud's early theory of the unconscious. I'm going to leave that aside right now. It would divert us from what I really want to talk about. But now what we have here is a theory of repression as the primary mechanism that's operating between these two systems, which are substantive systems, structural systems within the psyche, rather than that adjectival way of thinking about the unconscious that comes out of Leibniz. So once we have that in place, we can begin to contrast these elements. There is one other thing to add here, because it'll play a role in how we think about things such as symbol and sign, image word and image and so on. This is from the philosopher of science, Patricia Kitcher, who's written a very important book on the interdisciplinary sources of Freud's system. And she makes a critical point about the way that this system is working. As I remarked, that as the repression takes place, it is the energy of the impulse that gets diverted into the system unconscious. As Kitcher says, language was the necessary vehicle for conscious thought. Now, that's over in the system conscious. If this were true, it was a reasonable hypothesis that ideas that were unconscious had been cut off from their associated word representations. Since he assumed that the reflex nature of the neural apparatus and the association of ideas, Freud was led to the further hypothesis that in hysteria the energy from an unconscious idea that could not be discharged in speech was channeled through associations to other inappropriate somatic outlets. That's what I'm illustrating here with this previous diagram. As you get the symptomatology leaving the system unconscious because it is no longer connected to the original word, the original linguistic foundation of consciousness. It has to find some other way of expressing itself. This is also why Freud, or the basic model of analysis in Freud's system, is to return the repressed material to language. Obviously, this ties very tightly in with the whole idea of free association, bringing material back into language, the talking cure, so to speak. Now, we can look at this from a different angle, from a psychoanalytic angle. In 1954, Jacques Lacan had a meeting with Jung. They spent some time together. And in Écrit, Lacan gives us a very interesting, I would say, but also characteristically Lacanian comment on the distinctions between Jung and Freud having to do with this question of language. And we'll see how that also ties into the question of image, word and image. Because Lacan writes, "It is of the utmost importance to observe, in the experience of the unconscious other, where Freud is our guide, that the question does not find its outlines in protomorphic proliferations of the image, in vegetative intumescences, or in animastic halos radiating from the palpitations of life. This is the whole difference between Freud's orientation and that of Jung's school, which latches on to such forms, Wandlungen der Libido. These forms may be brought to the fore in a mantic, for they can be produced using the proper techniques, promoting imaginary creations such as reveries, drawings, etc. If Freud rejected this mantic, it was at the point at which it neglects the guiding function of a signifying articulation, the word, which operates on the basis of its internal law of material subjected to the poverty that is essential to it. In other words, the austerity of language, as Lacan sees it, and the very structural form of language, which he gets primarily from Ferdinand de Saussure. Similarly, it is precisely to the extent that this style of articulation has been maintained by virtue of the Freudian word that such a profound difference persists between the two schools. So Lacan here is, just as Deleuze had earlier distinguished between the differential unconscious of Leibniz and the system of Freud, and Ricoeur distinguishes between the adjectival and the substantive understanding of the unconscious. Lacan here is pointing to the radical distinction between the significance of the word in the system of Freud and the system of the image in the system of Jung. So we're going to have to understand a little bit about what's the business with the image in order to really ground our understanding of Jung. So some of you will have run into, no doubt, the distinction between symbol and sign. Now, if we go back to Lacan's comment here, he's talking about Freud's returning the psychic energy to the word and under that very disciplined way of thinking about language that Lacan is highlighting here. But precisely that way of relating to language does underlie Jung's distinction between the symbol and the sign. In the definitions in volume 6 of the collected works, that's the typology, psychological types, have the basic distinction in the definitions. The symbol, the concept of a symbol should, in my view, be strictly distinguished from that of a sign. Symbolic and semiotic meanings are entirely different things. And in a footnote earlier in the volume, he says, I say semiotic in contradistinction to symbolic. What Freud terms symbols are no more than signs for elementary instinctive processes. But a symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be expressed otherwise than by a more or less close analogy. So Jung is essentially here picking up precisely on Lacan's distinction, but he's now reversing it in some sense, and he is saying that that way in which Freud addresses repressed phenomena or the energy in the unconscious by way of language is in fact to address it by way of signs, not by way of symbols, even though Freud was the first one to be talking about the importance of symbols. But for Jung now, as he looks back on that from roughly 1920, when he's writing these definitions in psychological types, he views that as what he calls a semiotic approach, not a symbolic approach. And the symbol is going to take him in other directions. And we want to think about how the symbol and the image work with one another. Get to that in a moment, but just to elaborate this a little bit further and also to add another distinction that you should be aware of within Jung's system, because it shows up from time to time and in some discussions of these things, is the distinction, the way in which archetype and symbol are related to one another. I'm not going to go into much detail. I won't have much to say about archetypes in this particular presentation, but I do want to have this distinction on the table because it plays a role in some other things we'll be talking about. So this is from the seminar on dream analysis. And one of the participants, Dr. Schlegel, asks the question, do you identify the idea of archetypes with the idea of symbols, so that everything which has symbolical value can be considered as an archetype? And Jung says, no, the symbol is an entirely different conception. I would call an archetype a symbol when it was functioning as a symbol, but it doesn't necessarily function that way. The word symbol has been very much abused. For instance, the Christian faith is symbolized by the cross, which means the cross expresses something which cannot be expressed in any other terms. The Greek word symbolon means creed, and the original idea of the creed was not that now God is caught and we know exactly what he means. The actual creed is the nearest approach in a human way to certain intuitions and beliefs, the belief that God is the Father, and in the same person the Son and the Holy Ghost, for instance. The great mysteries of life and eternity could be expressed only by symbols, and therefore they were always sacred. So we have another distinction here between symbol and archetype. They can be closely related to one another, but not necessarily related to one another. Let's keep all of that going. And now I want to go back to Jung's thinking about the unconscious, which is going to pick up on a variation of a somewhat modified way of thinking about that Leibnizian structure. And overall, this is what one can refer to as the somnambulistic unconscious. I'll tell you why, explain why, using that terminology. And we're going to go through several steps here where we'll pick up the elements of thinking about the unconscious that are relevant to our discussion. So in the Tavistock lectures, we have a comment, this time not from a major French philosopher or psychiatrist, but from Eric Graham Howe, who was one of the founders of the Tavistock Institute, was closely associated with Jung and invited Jung to Tavistock to give the lectures at that time. A footnote on those Tavistock lectures, they were, as probably some of you are aware, attended by the relatively young therapist at the time, Wilfred Bion, and there is an increasing amount of work going on examining how Bion's presence at the Tavistock lectures influenced the development of some of his post-Kleinian thinking in psychoanalysis. I won't be able to touch on that directly, and I'm about to be visited by my furry assistant here, so if you hear sound in the background, it's because the furry assistant has decided to join me. Eric Graham Howe, put your tail down, it's not polite. Eric Graham Howe makes this comment. He's commenting to Jung, who has presented an outline of his theory of the unconscious that's basically a diagram of concentric circles going in from higher conscious levels down to the center point, which is the collective unconscious. It's a very structural diagram of Jung's thinking about the unconscious and how somewhat takes him to task in a way that's important. Howe makes the comment, according to Freudians, there is a place, a thing, an entity called the unconscious. According to Professor Jung, as I understand him, there is no such thing. He's moving in a fluid medium of relationship, and Freud in a static medium of unrelated entities. To get it clear, Freud is three-dimensional, and Jung is, in all his psychology, four-dimensional. For this reason, I would criticize it, if I may, the whole diagrammatic system of Jung, because he is giving you a three-dimensional presentation of a four-dimensional system, a static presentation of something that is functionally moving, and unless it is explained, you get it confused with the Freudian terminology, and you cannot understand it. Now, to my mind, this is a very important comment to keep in mind, and in fact, Jung replies to Graham Howe that he says, well, basically, yes, I have to agree with you on that, but I'm trying to be understandable to people, and talking about four-dimensional psychology is just too disruptive for most people's understanding, so I don't go there. We want to keep in mind what Graham Howe is saying here. Any structural, diagrammatic rendering of Jung's theory of the unconscious is inherently misleading. That's what Graham Howe is saying. It's inherently misleading in and of itself, and it is even more misleading in the degree to which it begins to look like it is an elaboration on the Freudian model of the unconscious. If we go back to Ricoeur's comment, it is giving up the adjectival to too great a degree and moving too strongly towards the structural way of thinking about the psychic system. So keep that in mind. You'll find lots and lots of diagrams of how Jung's system is set up. They are all sort of set up in hierarchical patterns and so on. And we really want to think about the unconscious in somewhat different terms from that. So, um, five very, very important influences on Jung's actual development of his system, leaving Freud aside at this point. In the center is William James, probably the foremost psychologist of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and of course his principles of psychology continue to be used in psychology departments. In the upper right-hand corner, the philosopher Henri Bergson, French philosopher Henri Bergson, considered by many at that time to be the most important philosopher in the world. The upper left-hand corner is Theodore Flournoy, who was very close with Jung, provided Jung with a great deal of support during the time that the relationship with Freud was falling apart. Also provided Jung with the materials that became the basis for symbols of transformation, the Wandlungen and Symbole der Libido, and wrote a very important book, study of a medium dissociative psychology called From India to the Planet Mars. In the lower left-hand corner is Pierre Janet, with whom Jung studied for a period shortly after he had completed his medical degree, and when he was beginning to work at the Berkeley. Janet was the first psychologist to really investigate dissociative disorders, multiple personality disorder. And in the lower right-hand corner, Conway Lloyd Morgan, who was a British comparative psychologist from whom Jung got many of his examples of animal behavior that you'll run into throughout Jung's, particularly his earlier writings on archetypes and so on. And I'll touch on some of Conway Lloyd Morgan's examples that Jung picked up directly. One of the other important things about these five individuals is that they were very closely associated with one another. They knew one another, they frequently met with one another, they highly respected one another, all five of them. And there were some others, such as James Mark Baldwin, who also fit into this group. And the other aspect is, with the possible exception of Conway Lloyd Morgan, although he picked up on the material that the other four were working on in some of his later work, Bergson, James, Flournoy, and Janet were all interested in the study of phenomena such as trance phenomena, mediumship, other kinds of altered states of consciousness were central to their work between, let's say, 1890 and 1920. This is a particular focus. James was studying mediums in New England. Janet was working with dissociative states. Both James and Bergson were president of the British Society of Psychical Studies. There were other figures that played a role in that. Both Patrick van der Meersch in his book, and also Mark Sabin in his recent book on Jung, go into some of the significance of the Society of Psychical Research and that influence on Jung. And so we have an important group of figures here influencing Jung. So how are they doing that? We have these different models of the psyche at work. One is now the dissociative unconscious of Janet, James, Flournoy, and Jung. And this comes out very strongly from Pierre Janet's work, where he begins to investigate the ways in which the conscious representations that we had down here coming out of Leibniz can now establish an entirely independent, dissociated consciousness in some other part of the general environment that we've referred to as uh, the, uh, the differential unconscious, the adjectival unconscious. This is a space now of dissociated fragments, intuitions, trance states, and other altered states of consciousness. This would be Genet's way of thinking about it. Jung picks up on this. It forms the basis for Jung's thinking about the status of complexes as individually established, fragmentary elements of the psyche that may or may not contain conscious content. Also dissociative states. So we begin to see this way in which we're thinking about it. And of course, this dissociative model plays a role in Jung's dissertation on so-called occult phenomena, which is based on a series of seances that were in actuality conducted within his family, the medium in question being his first cousin, Helena Preiswerk. And the dissociative unconscious. The seances reflected Genet's dissociative model and the somnambulistic connection to a level of deep historical continuity across generations in the psyche. Jung saw the same patterns in the Miller fantasies that form the basis for symbols of transformation, and interpreted the phenomena of psychotic patients in a similar light. So, just to go back, this space now, as I remarked when we were talking about Leibniz, it is not bounded in the sense that Freud's system is bounded. Okay, and it may even for Bergson, memory comes in here, and memory is not just remembering things. It may even have a transcendental quality that has memory, not just evolutionary influences running through time. Now, the somnambulistic unconscious, Bergson and Jung. This is another aspect of what we're talking about here when we think about Jung. This is a slightly different way of looking at the same phenomenon. We have conscious representations, again, in this fragment of the entire system that is in fact demarcated by consciousness. Now let's say that there is an element here that is in some sense comes within the range of perception for consciousness. And consciousness is aware of this element out in this larger space, but it defines it very specifically. And there may be another element out here. And again, it gets defined by consciousness very specifically. Basically, the epistemological structure of conscious representation discriminates elements of the world that come within conscious perception in this way of thinking about it. That's important to keep in mind, for reasons I'll show you in a moment. But the somnambulistic unconscious, this idea would take the position that within the frame, outside the boundaries of conscious representation, these elements here may in fact consist in a single structure rather than as two discrete elements. Now, this plays itself out in an example that Bergson uses in his book Creative Evolution, published in 1907, which Jung read at the time of its publication. And this is an example that Bergson uses. Bergson, some of these thinkers, and of course this is where Conway Lloyd Morgan will play a role as well, with his animal examples, very, very interested in some exotic animal behaviors. This is an instance where this wasp is a solitary wasp, builds a nest in a hole in the ground, comes out of the nest, finds a particular kind of caterpillar, stings the caterpillar at the nerve ganglions that paralyze the caterpillar, takes it back into its nest, lays an egg on the caterpillar. When the egg hatches, the wasp larva will feed on the still living caterpillar until it molts and turns into a wasp. So Bergson has this to say about this phenomenon, which a little bit earlier in the text he explicitly distinguishes from the way in which an entomologist would view the same phenomenon. He says we must suppose a sympathy, in the etymological sense of the word, between the Ammophila and its victim, which teaches it from within, so to say, concerning the vulnerability of the caterpillar. This feeling of vulnerability might own nothing to outward perception, but result from the mere presence together of the Ammophila and the caterpillar, considered no longer as two organisms, but as two activities. It would express in concrete form the relation of the one to the other. So just as we had it here, the perceiving entomologist will see two entities, but the entities themselves exist actually as one entity by way of an entirely different connection, which Bergson refers to as sympathy. Jung, in fact, picks up on the theme of sympathy. We can discuss this at some other later point. Shows up in some of his other discussions of animal behavior in relation to phenomena that one can call archetypal. And in fact, he draws on Conway Lloyd Morgan to explain. This one comes from volume 8 of the collected works, where he says this is the yucca moth example from Conway Lloyd Morgan. Just as conscious apprehension gives our actions form and direction, so unconscious apprehension, through the archetype, determines the form and direction of instinct. If we call instinct refined, then the intuition which brings the instinct into play, in other words, the apprehension by means of the archetype, must be something incredibly precise. Thus the yucca moth must carry within it an image, as it were, of the situation that triggers off its instinct. This image enables it to recognize the yucca flower and its structure. So now we're moving into this space of the archetypal image. And Jung gives us a very precise definition of the image, again in volume 8, where he writes, the instinct of the leaf-cutting ant fulfills the image of ant, tree, leaf, cutting, transport, and little ant garden of fungi. If any one of these conditions is lacking, the instinct does not function, because it cannot exist without its total pattern, without its image. Now the image then, we're now thinking about the archetypal image more as a gestalt than as something specific. Now, this is worth keeping in mind when we think about how archetypal or images work. Take, for example, going to a museum and seeing a small statue of Osiris in the Egyptian collection, and thinking to yourself, well, now that's archetypal. Well, if we take the archetypal image seriously, we would have to say no, it's not. In fact, it may only be, to use the earlier language, a sign of Egyptian religious practices. But one would have to imagine that for it to be an image, particularly an archetypal image, you would want it embedded in its entire context, in its ritual context, in its social context, and that the archetypal image is made up of all of those elements as they interact with one another. So be a little bit careful about that as you're thinking about how archetypal images may work in your thinking about analytical psychology. So I want to talk a little bit now. We've got all of this material on the table, different models of the unconscious, a very distinct separation between Freud and Jung. Now, how does this idea of the image come into play for Jung? This you'll find in uh, Jung's discussion of the encounter with the unconscious in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he says, to the extent that I could manage to translate the emotions, these are the emotions that go with his writing of the Red Book, to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. There is a chance that I might have succeeded in splitting them off. That would have been a Jeunean dissociation, splitting them off. But in that case, I would inexorably have fallen into a neurosis and so been ultimately destroyed by them anyhow. As a result of my experiment, I learned how helpful it can be, from the therapeutic point of view, to find the particular images which lie behind emotions. So he could split them off and you get a dissociative state, but staying with the image, which we now understand is a richer concept than simply the sign that Freud would have used, we're able to make sense out of and have more control over and a more therapeutic, a more healthier relationship to the emotions. Now, this is the encounter with the unconscious, and it brings us to the Red Book. And I want to just spend a few minutes here, since we've had these natural history examples of the wasp and the yucca moth and the leaf-cutting ant and so on, to see how important this organic, naturalistic, embedded sense of the image is for Jung and for looking at the Red Book. And some of what I'm going to show you here owes a great deal to work that was done by Joe Cambray around 2010, shortly after the Red Book was published. A paper he presented at a conference in San Francisco on the Red Book. The proceedings of that were published as a book. Tom Kirsch and I edited that, and you may want to find Joe's paper. But here's another important figure in this story, Ernst Haeckel, very important German biologist, strong supporter of Darwin at this time, working primarily on small microscopic aquatic organisms. He was also an extremely accomplished artist, and beginning in the 1860s, began painting pictures, drawings, very meticulously constructed drawings of the organisms that he was researching. In the 1890s, these were put together in what's effectively a coffee table book called Kunstformen der Natur, which was very, very popular, again, as a coffee table book. But Jung was familiar with his drawings, as most people were, prior to the publication of this book. So we have this from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's dream of the radiolarians. I was in a wood. It was threaded with watercourses, and in the darkest place I saw a circular pool surrounded by dense undergrowth. Half immersed in the water lay the strangest and most wonderful creature, a round animal, shimmering in opalescent hues, and consisting of innumerable little cells, or of organs shaped like tentacles. It was a giant radiolarian, measuring about 3 feet across. It seemed to me indescribably wonderful that this magnificent creature should be laying there undisturbed in the hidden place, in the clear, deep water. It aroused in me an intense desire for knowledge, so that I awoke with a beating heart. Now, if we go to the Red Book, you'll of course find this first illustration, which is a very peculiar one. There's a great deal of symbolism in here, which I'm not going to try and unpack at this time. But for our purposes, based on that dream, we have this water area here, seemingly in the middle of a Swiss village, with the peculiarity of jellyfish and coral, uh, rather unusual for a Swiss mountain scene. But if we think back to that dream, it would appear that, at least in part, Jung is incorporating elements of that dream into the first illustration in the Red Book. But if we go to the Kunstformen der Natur, we will find these illustrations. And we can see how Jung is both picking up on this in his illustration for the Red Book, but in all likelihood, having seen these illustrations around the time that he was contemplating his own future, they become incorporated into his dream life and shape the way in which he's thinking about his own career. Another example. This is a page from Kunstformen der Natur, in this instance. These are radiolarians, quite a few of them, and of course, you can probably imagine that this is where this is going. Jung again picking up on these images. Now, there are other qualities to these images and some of the images in the Red Book, and Joe has quite a few more examples of where Jung has clearly been picking up imagery from the Kunstformen der Natur in shaping particularly his mandala images. And there is a mandala-like quality to these images, as you can see, that gets reproduced here. And I'm not going to try and elaborate on that at this point. I've written several papers on the subject of mandala, the geometry of mandalas, and how they relate to the geometry of these other natural figures and the geometry of figures in the Red Book, but also particularly in other mandala symbolism from Buddhist tradition and other traditions. So there is very much a way in which Jung is picking up on a universal quality of the mandala structure. It's referred to as the fractal structure of these images in the Red Book, but again drawing on natural patterns, just as he did with the yucca moth, or we could go back to the wasp and other natural figures, and the way in which the natural world plays a significant role in Jung's thinking about these structures. So with that in hand, what I've tried to give you here is an overview of the elementary foundational ways of thinking about the unconscious, how that relates to these other issues in analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, the adjectival, the structural approach to the unconscious, or the differential unconscious of Leibniz as it comes down to Bergson and the other investigators of particularly dissociative and trance-like phenomena, altered states of consciousness, which Jung picks up on directly. And as I say, my objective here was to, as clearly as possible, distinguish between the way Jung is approaching these questions and the Freudian system that sits over here in a different space from Jung's system. We'll have an opportunity to discuss these issues during the course itself. I hope that this sets a frame for you to work from, and I will look forward to meeting all of you in person when we have the course itself.